Good afternoon. My name is Carolyn Hiller, and I am the Program Director for Clinical Diagnostics at the Medical Device Innovations Consortium. Welcome to our webinar. We have just released our real-world evidence generation, advancing regulatory science and patient access for IVDs framework. This framework is now open for public comment through June 15th. 2020. At the end of the webinar, we will be explaining the process and how you can provide your comments. We welcome your comments into the process. MDIC, or the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, we're a 501c3, a public-private partnership. We were created to focus solely on advancing regulatory science of medical devices for patient benefit. We bring together various stakeholders working on medical devices, including IVDs, and look at how we can create a regulatory science to help navigate established regulation. MDIC does not do policy. We focus on science. Within MDIC, we have a broad program portfolio. If you look at our website, you'll be able to get an overview of the different projects that are involved and how you can become involved with MDIC's different initiatives.
Sorry, Carolyn, to interrupt,
yes?
Are you sharing your screen?
I am not. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Tyler. My apologies to everybody on the call here. All right. Here we go. Thank you, everyone. I am Carolyn Hiller, and I explained MDIC, we're a public-private partnership, and we focus on the intersection of the different stakeholders to help bring technology to patients. Within MDIC, we have a very diverse portfolio looking at various areas that can help bring products to market. And I focus on the clinical diagnostics, and this project is part of that program. Within the diagnostics, we do have a number of different initiatives. They do have regulatory science tools that are available for download. You can find those on our website as well as this draft guidance. Now what I'd like to do is I'm going to turn the webinar over to Danelle Miller. Danelle is our steering committee chair for the clinical diagnostics program. She is our working group chair also for the IVD real world evidence project. So Danelle.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. In August of 2017, FDA, could you go back to the other slide? In August of 2017, FDA published a final guidance, which was use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices. I think we as industry applaud the agency for this important guidance, and it goes a long way in establishing when real-world evidence can support regulatory decision-making for devices. The IVD real-world evidence framework that we're talking about today seeks to provide additional information to guide use of real-world evidence in support of IVDs, which differ from therapeutic devices and how the data might show up in the real world. This framework represents years of hard work and robust discussions between members of the IVD industry, FDA, and then other MDIC member organizations, including, for example, CDC, as well as just the focus that we've had on how do you use real-world evidence as an alternative or supplemental form of clinical evidence to accelerate innovation of IVDs while really enabling patient and healthcare professional access to IVDs technologies that are safe and effective. So with that, I'd like you to take a look at the next slide, which is the scope. So the scope of the framework really is focused on current real-world data and real-world evidence landscape. There was a lot of focus on what's out there right now, potential applications of real-world evidence that are in support of IVD pre-market regulatory decision-making, potential applications of real-world data in support of post-market issues, a proposed approach to evaluate the relevance and reliability of RWD to assess the data quality for IVD regulatory decisions, which is very important for IVD companies, and then also suggestions on study designs and methods to generate this valid scientific real-world evidence for IVD regulatory assessment. Because let's face it, although real-world evidence may not be out there, it's not usable unless it really meets the standard for valid scientific evidence. And this is intended to guide a little bit on when is that going to be. Next. The team, which included a wide range of companies, organizations, education and experience and skill sets, took sort of a methodical, process-oriented approach to development. And we were divided into sub-teams. And the sub-team started out with, let's just talk about the terms. Make sure that we're all aligned on what is the glossary, what is real-world data, what is real-world evidence. And so we developed a glossary. Then we did a landscape analysis to survey IVD manufacturers to even assess how much are you using real-world evidence today? How much would you like to be using real-world evidence, not only for pre-market, but across the total product life cycle. We also conducted a literature search and updated that for how is IVD real-world data and real-world evidence being used and published, and then described data quality and methods for using IVD real-world data. So as you can see, there was a pretty wide scope of what we tried to do in putting together this framework. Next. And that took a lot of people. The team worked tirelessly, and I thank each and every one, which are listed here and in the framework. I'm not going to read out all of these names, but as chair of this working group, I can tell you that there was very broad engagement, a lot of very smart people working together toward a common goal to bring about this framework. And with that, I'll hand it over to Wendy Rubenstein from the FDA to talk further about the FDA's approach with the framework.
Okay, thank you, Danelle. So thank you very much to MDIC for the opportunity to share some thoughts with your members today. I really applaud the IVD working group for developing this framework, and I also want to thank my colleagues at FDA for their input and for their support. We heard from Carolyn about the opportunity for public comments, and we're looking forward to seeing that feedback, and I just want to encourage all of you to take the time to submit your own comments. So the agency and CDRH have had a long time goal to use real-world data within the total product life cycle, including pre-market submissions, including post-market surveillance. And the overarching goal is to assess the safety, effectiveness, and even the value proposition of diagnostic tests. You know, we seek to help improve patient access, foster innovation. And so the NEST-CC, the National Evaluation System for Health Technology Coordinating Center, that's one important pillar that's got, I think, a good head start. Their roadmap is to support regulatory coverage, patient and clinical decision-making. And then as mentioned, CDRH released the guidance in 2017 on the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices. So during the review process, it's important to strike the right balance between pre- and post-market evaluation of device performance. Now, you know, collecting data in the post-market setting may, in some cases, help to speed access to diagnostics because expectations are set post-clearance or post-approval. In addition, facilitating the use of regulatory-grade RWD in the pre-market setting may help to provide greater reliability for actual test performance. And we'll talk a little more about that. And as well, submission of RWD in the pre-market setting could speed access to diagnostics and even reduce the time and the cost associated with data generation. Because for the most part, we're talking about data that has already been collected. The hard part here is to make sure that the collection is really fit for purpose and of high enough quality to use. So we know that device effectiveness, as it's presented in a pre-market submission, it's not always borne out in real-world practice. And an analogy is that we know for many, maybe even the majority of clinical trials, which are the gold standard, particularly for therapeutics, a benefit in a clinical trial is generally diluted when it's applied in usual care outside of the trial. And there are many reasons for that. One that I like to point to is external validity. So, logically, having otherwise perfectly healthy patients who are relatively young compared to the population of interest for the intended use, people who have high socioeconomic status, who don't have comorbidities. This is obviously doesn't translate well to the US population. And this is an opportunity where using RWD in pre-market settings should help to mitigate this problem and more accurately predict similar results in real-world settings. And we should also be able to get to a place where it's actually easier and less expensive to collect real-world data rather than completely rely on the generation of new data for diagnostic submissions. In other words, this can support a least burdensome approach that reduces the time and cost of evidence development for regulatory decisions. And so we know that RWD have historically been of variable quality. Maybe I've gotten a bit of a bad rap, I think, but the more contemporary, retrospective, even prospective RWD sources are getting to be of progressively higher quality. And the process that we're engaging in here through this framework and through the work of MDIC is helping us get to that higher level. So CDRH has been doing a number of things, as I mentioned. I want to mention the over 100 diagnostic EUAs that have now been approved by the Division of Microbiological Devices at OIR. From reading the paper that COVID diagnostics are in the limelight, and it's essentially a perfect storm. It's one that we never would have wanted, but a pandemic unifies purpose. So COVID can actually result in driving the community toward the common purpose of generating evidence on real test performance of these SARS-CoV-2 molecular diagnostics, including the antibody tests and the direct antigen tests. Now, that's going to require the definition of common data elements to support the use cases, and will require incentivization of data flows. But setting up this framework can then help expand this work to medical uses beyond COVID. So in other words, there's an opportunity to use the activation energy created by the pandemic to build an infrastructure that will extend beyond COVID. So the Reagan Udall Evidence Accelerator, and they have a meeting actually going on right now at this time. The Accelerator is taking on this work for COVID to rapidly generate useful evidence to inform clinical, public health, and policy decisions. So as one example of the work at hand, the Accelerator is surveying stakeholders for the necessary data elements and data specifications that are needed to address many key questions, such as the accuracy of testing, the role of the specimen type, the relationship to clinical symptoms and the clinical course, and questions about immunity and so forth. And I find this very reminiscent of the work that I helped to foster in developing MCODE, the minimal common oncology data elements, in that you need to start with a clinical use case, find data that's fit for purpose, and ask key stakeholders in the community what are the key facets that are important to answer the key questions. So these efforts are going to be supported by the framework of FDA's SHIELD project, which is SHIELD is a public-private partnership. It's focused on data lab standards, and it's one of the pillars needed to make the data accessible. So in a nutshell, by developing LOINC code, laboratory code, mapping manuals for a test that's ordered and for the test that's resulted, there's an enormous amount of test code ambiguity that limits the use of LOINC codes. They're applied inconsistently. So this ambiguity is reduced or eliminated. That allows data to be harmonized across many different sites, actually even within a given organization. And that supports data aggregation at scale. So when you're thinking about how can I use real world data, please read yourself into the white paper as you go through it. So, for example, which of the use cases fit the submissions in your organization's line of sight? Try to think about concrete examples as you listen to Tyler's presentation. And as you do that, think about how would you supplement your pre-market submission with supporting real world data? How can you source high quality data from healthcare systems or from RWD aggregators who are already sourcing and harmonizing? What are the requirements of the data that you need to acquire to make it fit for purpose and to answer the questions that you want to address? So lastly, I want to encourage you to engage with FDA through the pre-submission or Q-sub process to discuss your ideas for using RWD in your submission. This is a new area, and I think you'll find that the pre-submission process will be very useful to you. In that process, FDA can provide feedback about individual data elements contained within an existing RWD source you have in mind, whether these are fit for purpose in the regulatory context, and various other questions you may have that are specific to your submission. So keep the points in mind from the white paper about the strengths and limitations of RWD. And with time, the agency will gain more confidence in RWD through these conversations and through the review process. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tyler.
Great. Thanks a lot, Wendy. So my name is Tyler ONeill, and I am also from Roche Diagnostics. But nevertheless, I certainly am not speaking here for myself, but rather a large working group that Danelle had highlighted at the beginning of the presentation, who contributed over the last few years on this work. And we certainly couldn't have come to this document without their input, their perspective, and their leadership in developing this framework. And also want to acknowledge Carolyn for her effort in developing this over the last few years as well. So thank you very much. So Carolyn, if you could just go to the first, next slide, please. This framework really is built on the FDA guidance by providing what we feel is additional contextual information to help industry as well as the FDA and other relevant bodies in considering both when and how real-world data, their appropriate study designs and statistical methodologies can be used in order to generate real-world evidence, and how that real-world evidence might subsequently be incorporated into product development, and also be continuous with and be within scope of valid scientific evidentiary needs for both pre and post-market regulatory decision-making for in vitro diagnostics. Importantly, this framework really wanted to underscore the both the differences of in vitro diagnostics relative to some of the other therapeutic devices, which are also classified as medical devices by the FDA, in order to provide necessary value and insight to develop the utility of real-world data for in vitro diagnostic manufacturers. The approach taken by the working group was primarily to highlight the value of such data and evidence in order to streamline the regulatory process for bringing innovative and new technologies to market, while at the same time continuing to maintain reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for IVDs. Because as we heard, this does not necessarily change, but rather provides additional data sources from which the regulator can assess our products. Next slide, please, Carolyn. And so I'll go over, although somewhat asynchronously, some of the highlights of the framework in the following slides. The first objective of the framework was, as Danelle had mentioned, was to develop a glossary of terms which were necessary to ensure that a common foundation of language was established by all those on the working group, and also provide a resource in the framework for which manufacturers and the FDA could find common language and agreement. This glossary was based on previous scientific terminology using real-world data. And we also explored both within and across domains of observational study designs and methods to develop appropriate language used throughout the framework. Importantly, the working group did agree that the FDA's description of both real-world data and evidence represented the most accurate and appropriate definitions to capture the breadth of such data from a variety of sources, as well as the methods necessary to generate evidence. And as shown on the screen here, although I'm sure many of those on the call today are familiar with it, we really see real-world data as those that are relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And then with the appropriate application of study design and method, that subsequently can become evidence. Again, as a definitional foundation, it's really clinical evidence regarding the use of potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from analysis of real-world data. And although we don't put any limitations on what constitutes real-world data in terms of source, a few examples are listed here and include such sources as electronic health records, insurance claims, patient registries, and even digital health applications. And I would encourage that time is spent reviewing the glossary to ensure that all necessary and appropriate language has been used by the working group, and that it captures the breadth of language that should be used within the real data space. Following this foundation of language, we then move to agree on the potential value of real-world data with consideration on the iterative development cycle of the majority of IVD devices. It was agreed that in most instances, real-world data are not generated for the explicit purpose of research. And as such, the framework provides a detail on several limitations to be considered and addressed when considering the use for regulatory purposes. These include, but are certainly not limited to, inaccurate recordings of health or disease events, common systematic biases, missing data or variables of interest, including unique device identifiers, insufficient clinical details or temporal uncertainty about the specific IVD, and also opaque reporting of data collection and management, including an inability to establish data provenance and evaluation data quality. In all cases, though, real-world evidence used for regulatory assessment, the working group supports the invitation of the FDA to engage early, as was highlighted by Dr. Rubenstein, and we see this as a welcome partnership to bring necessary products to market with new and innovative approaches. Next slide, please, Carolyn. Really important to highlight here is the fundamental evidentiary requirements continue to be risk-based, regardless of the origin of the data. In appropriate settings, using real-world evidence can be a source or a supplement to reasonable assurance of IVD safety and effectiveness using appropriately representative heterogeneous target patient populations in medical practice in which the IVD is used. And it also represents a valuable element of an overall regulatory strategy. This includes establishing both analytical and clinical validity with emphasis on the value of real-world data for the latter. As such, the framework really does highlight the potential value of real-world data across the total product lifecycle of iterative development. And the example that's given here would be that real-world data may have value for early R&D work. And although this may not be explicit in all aspects of a regulatory submission, such data may offer considerable efficiencies related to the product of traditional clinical trials. Examples include site or patient identification, feasibility studies, meeting design control requirements, and expanded indications for IVD uses or so-called off-label use. But we also believe that there's value that can be realized through IVD device clinical validation, where real-world evidence may provide evidence necessary to identify, demonstrate, or support clinical validity, or generate performance characteristics such as sensitivity or specificity, and support investigational device exemption submissions for a significant risk IVD. We also note in the framework that in some instances, the inclusion of real-world data from a CLIA-certified laboratory to validate an assay for a new intended use, as well as data from outside the United States, may be considered if the relevance can be appropriately addressed in the context of benefits and risks posed by the IVD. Real-world data may also offer considerable value in settings where clinical studies are impractical to conduct, such as rare diseases or low prevalence of relevant outcomes. In all cases, relevant data generated in routine clinical practice to support regulatory assessment must, of course, be evaluated with the same scientific rigor as any other data source that we might consider using from clinical trials or otherwise, and fundamentally ensuring that both necessary parameters for data quality and assurance, along with methods and study design to generate valid scientific evidence are maintained. And really, this is the main focus of the framework in and of itself. And we go into some level of detail along with examples across the life cycle of a product of when and how real-world data and evidence can be applied within a regulatory context. In all cases, the use of real-world data are really, though, predicated on acknowledging and addressing both strengths and limitations, including issues such as data reliability, which includes data accrual, quality control, and data assurance, issues of data linkages, data eligibility, and justifying relevance to address in whole or in part the regulatory question for a given product. Next slide, please, Carolyn. And to really underscore these issues that are the center of the framework describes in detail non-exhaustive basic study design considerations for the use of real-world data in both clinical performance and outcome studies, including reference to relevant statistical guidance for studies evaluating diagnostic tests. Considerable effort is also made to clearly articulate examples of real-world data use in pre-market decision-making, such as inclusion of real-world data in virtual clinical performance studies, establishing aid in diagnosis claims, risk assessment or prognostic claims, use of advanced data science methods, including machine learning or artificial intelligence to establish cut points, and decision-making with use of multiple tests, which is of course particularly salient in time of coronavirus. The framework then concludes with two applied examples of authorizations leveraging real-world data, including the Illumina MySeq DX for cystic fibrosis, as well as the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center's MSK Impact Integrated Mutation Profiling of actionable cancer targets. From the perspective of the working group, such examples really highlight and demonstrate how real-world data have been used in the past for regulatory purposes. And we hope that the provision of these real examples will provide both support and encouragement for its use in future assessments by both IVD industry as well as the regulator. And so that really provides a high-level overview of what the framework details, and encourage all to provide constructive and concerted feedback on the working group's work that will bring considerable additional value to both the regulator and industry sponsors. And I thank all those in attendance for providing their time and feedback to this work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tyler. And for those that wish to ask questions to our panelists, you can type them into the chat box and we'll read them off in just a few minutes. Right now, I'm going to share with you how you can provide input on this framework to help us improve the document to make it a valuable tool in your work. The first thing that we'd like for you to do when you read the framework is find out, as you're reading through that, are there any statements that you disagree with? And we have the document line numbered. Please put the corresponding line number with your comment. That will greatly help us to reconcile the comments. Then, when you've found a comment that you disagree with, we ask for you, how do you think it should be written? Please provide that input and then give us your rationale. Why do you think that's the case? If you have references to support your rationale, we would especially appreciate that. Also, when you're reading over the document, we worked on this for quite a bit, and so we're close to the document. We welcome additional input from folks who weren't so close to it. Are we missing anything? What should we include in the document to make it a more useful tool in your work? Now, for the process, you can go to our website. You can download the website free. It's at MDIC.org. It's under our projects, our initiatives, and IVD real-world evidence. You can download the framework, and there also is, you'll find links to share your comments with the committee. The public comment period will close at the end of the day, June 15th, 2020. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin to read the questions. And again, we welcome your questions for the panelists. Okay, the first question that we have is, this question's for Dr. Rubenstein. For peer review publication evaluating an IVD device for LDT purpose, etc., will it be a good RWE for pre-marketing regulatory evaluation of this IVD device?
Interesting. So I think what we're talking about, the question is about a pre-existing publication. I don't know if that's tied to what the sponsor themselves produced or citing someone else. I think in either case, it comes down to the general principles that are in the framework. Things like traceability of the data, concerns about missingness and how that was addressed, you know, it all comes down to the quality. But you know, I mean, I think in general, passing through peer review is you know, a considerable bar. You know, depending on you know, the journal and the audience. But you know, yes, I think that's certainly something that can be supportive.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question here. For a product given EUA or enforcement discretion during COVID-19 pandemic, any good suggestion on collecting RWD during the emergency time for future pre-marketing approval? And I think that's open to any of the panelists.
I actually would suggest that Wendy start off on this one.
Well, I think I'll probably put my hat on of being in an organization previously that did collect such data, and you know, maybe the first thing is there an existing data aggregator that you might work with that has already started to solve some of the problems that are inherent in electronic health records and laboratory systems. You know, if of course you'll need to understand let's say the catchment area, how the tests are used and where, and you know, I think it just comes down to those practical issues of where to start. But other than that, it's definitely an ideal way to collect the data, and you know, we definitely encourage doing that.
I think one thing that I could add to that is this is a really good question, and the MDIC Clinical Diagnostic Steering Committee actually just approved last week a work item to look at or exploring use of real world evidence in support of an EUA submission, or I should say a submission of an EUA for clearance or approval. So it's definitely something that is being considered. I think Wendy's point about, is there a data aggregator? It's, you know, where is that data lying? And then looking at the framework. And one of the reasons we really wanted to get this framework out now was so that we could look at this framework as sort of a guide for the things to consider in making sure that the real world evidence would meet the, you know, the appropriate standards from a regulatory science perspective. Tyler, you may have some additional thoughts on that.
Nothing top of mind right now that hasn't already been highlighted. Sorry to let you down.
You never let me down.
Okay, I see another question here. Are there any recent examples where RWD or RWE from off-label use has been used as the principal data source in expanding an indication for use, particularly for prognostic, predictive, or monitoring biomarkers? Who wants to take that?
So I can speak more specifically about the process that we used in order to understand the landscape of the use of real world data. Not only did we do a what I believe was a comprehensive literature search trying to understand what the use of real world evidence was in the regulatory space or for regulated products for IVDs, but we also worked in partnership with the FDA, who did their own internal search. And that's actually how we came up with some of the examples that are in the document itself, both hypothetical as well as concrete examples, both as I highlighted at the end of my slides, both from Illumina and from MSK Impact. To speak specifically about the pathways for which diagnostics are being used, it wasn't the purpose necessarily to highlight every use case, but certainly as discussed in actually quite a bit of detail in the framework, the working group did believe that the use of real-world data for that purpose of potential claim expansion has considerable value and opportunity within the IVD space.
Okay, let's go to another question we have here. Has any consideration been given regarding RWD, RWE in pediatric studies, as the most limiting factor for all of us is sample procurement, especially in the very young?
Again, I can start this one off. And I think that one of the real value propositions of real world data, again, as spelled out in the framework itself, is when we think about rare diseases or rare outcomes or unique patient populations, from my perspective, this is where real world data can really shine. And so I would encourage the industry to explore outside of clinical trials to bring products to market. And as Wendy highlighted, and as did I, really engage with the FDA with their open invitation with the Q-Sub process to understand the appropriateness of that real-world data in the setting for which you're considering. Wendy, I'm not sure if you have anything additional to add.
I think you've laid it out nicely. I mean, there's mention of populations like rare diseases in the framework, and in a sense, you know, the pediatric population is simply understudied. So I can imagine data collection being done at centers where you know, high enough volumes of pediatric patients are seen, but also in terms of networks where you know, larger access to populations might be gained by collaborations across different healthcare systems. And in the latter case especially, there would need to be some, you know, possibly some pre-existing mechanism for data collection, given the hurdles that still exist to aggregate data.
Okay, Danelle, anything you want to add to that, or should we move to the next question?
No, I was going to say those two just nailed it. So I think it's great.
Great. Okay, we've got a question here, and I think this one's going to be directed at Wendy. Will the CDRH 510K or other search database be updated to include the option to search for clearances that utilized RWD and RWE?
So given that I wear a data hat a lot, or I have for the past few years, I really like that. I'll just take it as a suggestion. I don't know of conversations that have gone that far, but I can say I've got a number of reasons to expand the scope of what's searchable, and I think that's a really good one.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Thank you, Wendy, for taking that as a suggestion. I know when we were looking for examples originally, when we started working through this framework, we relied heavily on FDA itself to comb through its own records and identify good examples. And I think we do have some examples in there, and that's very hopeful. But I think access for all of us at some point would be great.
Great. Okay, here's another question. How does the panel weigh the use of meta-analysis for RWE, where perhaps less is known about individual sites, versus data from specific sites where data quality attributes are well known?
I'll start this off again, if that's okay. This is actually something that the working group spent quite a bit of time discussing. And whether or not we would include meta-analysis or literature using observational study designs and data in the scope of the framework. It was ultimately decided that both let's say, meta-analysis or systematic reviews and literature, fundamentally literature, would be excluded from the scope, and we would focus exclusively on those submissions that rely on real-world data itself. And we decided that although this is outside of the scope of clinical trial data, literature or meta-analyses don't necessarily sit in the same bucket as real-world data, although we understand that they are related. So I think that that there's value in that type of evidence, but it doesn't necessarily sit within primary real-world evidence.
I think I might add that what can be gained through a meta-analysis is always going to depend on the quality of the underlying studies and the underlying data. So if all of the underlying studies have good traceability and good discussions about how they address missing data and those sorts of things, then I think there'd be more confidence in a meta-analysis. But that at least until the field is more mature, I think that even though it may sacrifice some power and the ability to look at a large number of studies, it's probably going to be more useful, at least from a data submission standpoint, to look at these specific sites where you have confidence in the quality of the data.
Thank you. Janelle, anything you want to add?
No, sorry, I was on mute. No, sounds good.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next question here. RWD, RWE seems definitely more appropriate for pandemic management from a novel virus like the current situation. EUA accelerates review without reducing the rigor of proof for safety and efficacy for intended use. It makes sense to collect data than not and decide later what will be looked at or not based on applying some criteria for that decision. Will there be some strong recommendation or mandate to collect this data and reduce variability of the collected data to make it useful for analysis using AI, perhaps to get useful conclusions quickly? Who wants to take that?
I'm going to venture to say that that's something that we might see out of the Reagan Udall Evidence Accelerator.
Okay, and would that be with the common data elements that you discussed earlier and how important it is?
It's because exactly it's a framework for determining what are those central items that need to be decided on broadly, and this is kind of a mechanism for the community to have a reason to come together. I think that the question was more, is this something that's going to be mandated, required, etc.? I don't know that any of us are in a position to speak to that, but I do think that the Evidence Accelerator has those sorts of issues in their sites.
Okay. And let me see here. Are there any more questions? Individuals that are still on the line, now's the time. If you have any questions for the experts that we have on the line.
Carolyn, while we're waiting for questions, I'd like to add just to what Wendy said, and thanks, Wendy, great answer. I think when we look at something like an EUA or any type of situation where we really need to be tracking what the performance is in the real world, I think part of it is access, and this framework doesn't go to access, but it does discuss, what kinds of information you might need. I think common data elements that, like those that are being considered by Reagan Udall, and that we think about with respect to the EUA Real World Evidence Project at MDIC, are absolutely critical in thinking about what is the FDA going to need if this goes to clearance or approval. What do we as industry need to understand how our products are performing, et cetera. So I think you can expect, whether it's mandated or recommended in the future, that there will be considerable amount of work done on this in the coming months.
Thank you, Janelle. Okay, seeing no more, wait, we have another question. Is there a possibility to use ongoing RWD to refine an IVD? For instance, assume a cutoff is set within a defined study population. With high quality RWD, the population is expanded and additional statistical analysis is performed, perhaps within additional groups to further refine the cutoff. Who wants to take that?
When do you want to take a cut at it?
I just reacting to it, it seems like pretty fair game.
Yeah, I think it falls smack dab in what we describe in the framework as potential use. You've already got a cleared or approved product out there. You're making, a new claim or a new cutoff, something like that, I think Tyler went through an example like that. Seems like, as I like the way you say it, Wendy, it's fair game.
Okay. All right, seeing no more questions, panelists, you have anything else that you'd like to say? Otherwise, I think we'll wrap it up.
The only thing I'd like to say, just as chair of the group, is thank you to Wendy and to Tyler for really helping to get this done over the last few months to make sure that it's available for use, during this time. I look forward to the comments and really request that you look at this and tell us what you think so that we can make this the best framework for the IVD industry and for FDA and everyone involved, so that it's a very usable document.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank attendees for listening to the webinar, and we look forward to receiving your comments. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me. My email is chiller@mdic.org. And we wish everybody a safe and healthy day. Thank you.